Hello, everyone. My name is Randy Villegas, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz in the politics department. And today I'm here to talk to you about some of my research and my project, Voices from the Valley of Vulnerability. I also want to begin by thanking CARE, UC, Savannah Miller, Rachel Lehman, and my dissertation committee who has continued to support my work. And so what valley am I really talking about? Well, as you see from these photos, I'm talking about the central San Joaquin Valley. And as some of you might be able to read from some of these headlines and from looking at the partisan divide from their coastal counterparts, the Central Valley is often quite literally the opposite of what most people think of when they think of California. So both the political climate and the literal climate are a very stark contrast to what most people think of when they think of California or when they think of what California might be. I grew up in Kern County, which is that bottom county on that top right corner. Before beginning graduate school, I worked as a journalist and an organizer in Bakersfield, California. And I've been connected to organizing in the region for about 7 years. And as a son of Mexican immigrants, I witnessed firsthand many of the issues that affect youth and families in the region, issues like air pollution, poverty, the school to prison pipeline, a lack of opportunities for youth, racial discrimination, and the vast amount of economic inequality that you can witness simply by driving to the other side of the 99 freeway. And so my own experiences growing up in an immigrant family actually led me to my central research question of how do different localized political contexts shape the engagement of youth from mixed status families, right? And so we know that the context that immigrants face in their communities really helps shape the way and the extent to which they become active in public life. But most studies of youth within mixed status families have all really been centered in politically liberal or urban areas with mainly pro-immigrant policies. And we haven't really explored how youth are participating in more rural and conservative contexts. And so I examined this question using ethnographic methods, including semi-structured interviews, a focus group, and very limited participant observations due to the COVID-19 pandemics affecting protest activities and any in-person meetings. And really, youth from mixed status families are faced with this duality of demands, right? On one hand, they might feel really empowered to be civically engaged in order to advocate on behalf of those family members who are undocumented themselves, right? Well, on the other hand, they might be hesitant to get involved in any sort of, protest activity or engage in political participation for fear of disclosing their family status or even their own status, right? If they themselves are undocumented or are maybe DACA recipients, right? And so with this comes a variety of challenges, not only for research, but for mixed status families themselves. And prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, mixed status families were already facing a variety of social and economic challenges, as you can see in some of the bullet points presented here, with very low levels of health insurance, among the lowest out of any group, as well as high levels of poverty and vast health disparities. And so these circumstances have become even more challenging with immigrants less likely to take advantage of any resources that they might be eligible for due to the Trump administration's proposed public charge rules, right? And the COVID-19 pandemic further accelerating and exacerbating these conditions for immigrant families in the Valley. And so while the COVID-19 pandemic forced me to adapt my own research, in the sense that I had to pivot from in-person interviews to virtual interviews and virtual participant observations, really everybody was adapting, including mixed status families who unfortunately were left out of many of the COVID-19 relief efforts at the federal level, like stimulus checks and the Paycheck Protection Program for immigrant-owned businesses. And even at the statewide level, like while California did try to offer relief efforts for undocumented immigrants, many of the participants that I spoke to had a very challenging time even getting somebody on the phone, constantly calling these organizations that were distributing funds to undocumented families, facing very long wait times and oftentimes just giving up because they weren't able to reach somebody, right? And so with this, I wanted to present, some of my preliminary data and findings. So I think my first quote here by a young man named Carlos pretty much sums up how youth were feeling and their experiences growing up, right? And he said, from the moment I was old enough to understand it, they told me never to speak about it and never to mention it. They wanted to be discreet about it and just hide. And Carlos here, is speaking about his parents who told him at a very young age, don't tell anyone, don't trust anyone when it comes to talking about our status. And we also see how youth have begun to resist in many ways, right? Even if they're smaller efforts, like Fernando's actions, right? Who has an aunt and several cousins who are undocumented and who actually don't drive after 6 o'clock in the region because they're worried about checkpoints and interactions with law enforcement. And so what he does is, he would text his aunt and his cousins whenever there's checkpoints in town. And, it's something that they're conscious about and constantly trying to avoid. One of the most sort of heartbreaking moments during one of the interviews was when I spoke to 21-year-old Angelica, who was recalling her experiences growing up in a mixed status family and her family's guidance, right? And she told me as a little girl, whenever she went to school, she would never wear sandals because she would hear adults talking about ICE raids, and she wanted to make sure that she could have any shoe that she could run in, right? Because she just pictured the fact that if an ICE agent showed up, she would need those running shoes and sandals wouldn't do the job, right? And she could be followed or separated from her family. And so these are the sort of emotional and mental challenges that are exacerbated, especially in conservative contexts where there's a strong distrust of law enforcement for many of these communities. And of course, names have been changed to protect the identities of the participants. So like I mentioned earlier, youth spoke about their distrust of police and their unwillingness to call 911. Among them was 18-year-old Elena, who unfortunately had been attacked and robbed on her way home from school. And after debate, she and her family decided not to take the risk of calling the police because of their family's mixed status and their knowledge that the local sheriff was eager to collaborate with ICE authorities. And so as she put it, it's the fear that it is not only going to backfire on us, it shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't fear our own safety net, and unfortunately, this also highlights the intersectionality of the issue for Latina women and girls who are multiply marginalized due to their gender status and their undocumented status, or their mixed status families, right? I also heard a lot from youth about how this was empowering in many cases, like 18-year-old Myra, who for the first time participated in the 2018 midterm elections. And I'll never forget the story she told me about, voting on behalf of people who she felt couldn't vote, right, in her community, and speaking up and being a voice for the voiceless, as she put it, right? And what's very touching about this story was that Myra had an older sister who was a DACA recipient, meaning she herself couldn't vote. And when she cast her ballot, she took that ballot stub, she took her I voted sticker, brought it to her sister, gave her a hug, gave her the sticker and said, I voted for you, I voted for us, right? And so it really illustrates the fact that many youth might actually be more engaged, right, to participate in political politics and participation, right? And so as for recommendations for CARE and sort of the public at large, I've sort of broken up, to two sets of recommendations here, right? From a sort of grassroots and 501c3, perspective, supporting grassroots organizations that are already on the ground doing this work, organizations like the California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance, the Coalition for Humane and Immigrant Rights, CHIRLA, who has a Central Valley chapter. But it's also important to recognize that a lot of these youth organizing groups operate outside of this nonprofit industrial complex. For example, a group called the Current Youth Abolitionists, who sort of have broken away to start their own youth organizing group to not be under the same restrictions as a 501c3, who can engage in inherently political activities. And this has allowed them to adopt more strategies to highlight disparities for immigrants in their communities. And it's also important to extend organizational support and mutual aid to folks who are not eligible for programs like DACA, right, and who need additional resources to thrive and survive within their communities. From a more political perspective, it's crucial for us to support candidates and races, that are fully supportive of defending DACA, but also pursuing comprehensive immigration reform. At the local level, a lot of youth spoke about how sanctuary policies in the city of Delano, for example, seem to have made them feel more safer and more welcome in their community and created a sense of belonging despite the national rhetoric that made them feel otherwise. And this also could hopefully help resolve some of that mistrust between police. My last two recommendations, right? One key recommendation is supporting civics education that focuses on delivering curriculum in a nonpartisan way for the children of immigrants, right? So unlike their peers, children from mixed status families face these additional barriers to participation and don't necessarily learn about traditional forms of participation since their parents can't model behaviors like voting, registering, or donating to political campaigns. And finally, I'd like to encourage everybody to invest in mutual aid efforts that have already been established, like the Central Valley Mutual Aid and Collective Care Network. Savannah or I will include a link in the chat box. That pretty much concludes my time, and thank you all for your support.